Hello, this is ASEAN Movie Pulse Talks number 13. I am Panos Kotzathanasis. I am here with Rouven Linnarz
Hi there.
and Tom Wilmot.
Hello.
And today we're gonna talk about a modern classic of Japanese cinema, Takeshi Kitano's Violent Cup, a film that is as good as it is controversial. A lot of things happened with that film before it even began shooting. Tom, can you tell us a bit about it?
So the film was originally going to be directed by Kinji Fukasaku, who obviously had done the Yakuza films in like the 1970s. He kind of was known. He was a very commercially successful director in Japan at the time, and he was known primarily for the Battles Without Honor and Humanity series. He was originally slated to direct Violent Cop with Takeshi Kitano starring, but because of Kitano's work in TV and just sort of the scheduling conflicts that he would have had in it, I think it was a system where he would have been shooting 1 week on and then 1 week off. And Fukasaku just didn't want to work like that, so he ended up dropping out of the project. And a number of behind-the-scenes discussions led to Kitano being put in to direct the project, which was his directorial debut. I mean, he had obviously a lot of experience working in TV, but in terms of doing a sort of serious, dramatic crime film, it's something that would have been completely new to him. And I guess kind of the rest is history in terms of where his career went.
Okay, I guess, but I don't think that we can call him exactly a usurper, right? I mean, he took, I don't know, I think it couldn't have happened otherwise. I don't know. What do you think, Rouven?
Well, there are a couple of versions of the story. I think there's one version that I read by Kitano, which puts him in a very, very positive light. I think the producer, I can't remember his name, of Violent Cup, asked him whether he wanted to do the film in a sort of ironic manner. And Kitano said, well, yeah, sure, how hard can it be? I don't think the meeting, even though I've never been to a film production meeting of this sort, I don't think it has ever happened that way. But as Tom said, given his fame at the time, given the kind of roles that he had, I mean, he didn't star, but played a very, very specific and very important part in Oshima's Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, and many, many other films. Given his fame at the time, it was a logical step, perhaps not considered within the Japanese audience, who considered this film and many, many other films to be, let's say, Kitano's extravaganza or something like that.
Well, at the end, it definitely worked out for the best. The movie is really great, and this is what introduced Kitano to being a director, so we can say the result was good in the end. Rouven, you want to tell us a bit about the story of the movie?
Sure. Let's start off. First of all, as we heard, Takeshi Kitano did not just direct, but also starred in this film, playing a detective called Azuma. He has been with the Tokyo police force for quite some time and has gained a reputation as, well, as the title says, a violent cop, being prone to beating suspects, having very violent interrogation techniques, and in general being a pain to work with. And at the start of a film, we see him being at the head of an investigation which has to do with a dealer, a drug dealer having been murdered, and he has to babysit a new detective, a young detective, basically the only one who wants to work with him. And this sort of investigation, which seems simple enough on the surface, gets these two detectives deeper involved into, let's say, a plot which goes into the very core of the Tokyo police force, with corruption, with other detectives being involved, and little by little, these two detectives find themselves not just facing a crime syndicate, but also, let's say, the police force and the police chiefs. As a sort of parallel narrative, there is Azuma's sister, Akari, I think is her name, being released from the hospital. Not so sure about, but I think she's had a mental breakdown or something like that. And Azuma tries to take care of her but the more he gets involved in this, let's say, investigation, the more she also becomes a target for the crime syndicate, specifically the hitman called Kiyohiro, played by an actor we know, or let's say other people know from Hanabi, because he plays exactly the same role there as well.
Okay. So the movie begins in a very similar fashion with the Dirty Harry movie with Clint Eastwood. You have this cop who thinks he's over the law. He's very violent, and essentially he beats up his suspects, and then he gets chewed up by his boss, while the only one who wants to be his partner is a rookie. This is almost exactly the same of Dirty Harry, the beginning of Violent Cop. But Violent Cop goes a step beyond, particularly because the person whom Kitano's character, Azuma, beats up is actually a teenager. I don't think he's more than 15, 16. And the way he does it is by going to his house, like ringing the bell, and he tells his mother that I have some business with your son, and then proceeds on beating him. This is definitely on another level than the violence we see on the American movie. This is definitely beyond. I don't know, Tom, what do you think about these first scenes?
I think in hindsight, having seen the movie through, the first scene says a lot about Azuma as a character overall. You'll note as well, the teenager that he does end up beating up, he's chased down, well, not chased down, but sort of followed along with a group of other teenagers because they've beaten up a homeless person. And later on, when he is being chewed out by his boss, he's kind of asked, why didn't you step in and do anything? And again, looking back at the movie, it says a lot about his approach to violence and his enjoyment of violence, whether it be looking at it or dishing it out. I think there are many instances throughout the movie where he kind of takes every opportunity to do something violent, even when it's not really needed or necessary, or, you know, it could be as simple as slapping someone over the head, just kind of playfully, but not really, just given the nature of the character. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely like an abrasive opening, and it definitely lets you know the kind of character that you're dealing with, and maybe even the slapsticky way that he goes about beating people. You know, there's this, and I'm sure, you know, we'll talk about it for the rest of the film, and it's a theme that goes on throughout the rest of Kitano's films. There's a tinge of humor to the violence, but then it oversteps the mark at certain points and you're not sure anymore. So yeah, it's like on the face of it, it's beating up some teenager, but on the other hand, it's presented in such a kind of like blunt and humorous way. You're not really sure how to feel about it.
Rouven, about the introduction, how it sets up the character?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to compare him to, let's say, Harry Callahan, the role which made Clint Eastwood so iconic among others. When you see, let's say, Dirty Harry or many other cop thrillers of the time, the violence, even though it sounds sort of cynical to say that, serves a certain kind of purpose, to, you know, to get some answers, to get to the truth, to interrogate a subject or whatever it is. On the surface, it seems like this is what Kitano's Azuma is doing in that particular scene. He's trying to get someone to go to the police and confess and turn himself in. But then, as Tom said, you get to the point, especially when you watch it again, you kind of get the same questions in your head, like the chief of police does. Why didn't you step in? Why did you wait so long? I mean, it was obvious that these teenagers were doing something to this homeless person. Why did you wait and make this sort of sensationalist entry into this home, and this sort of intrusion into people's private lives, and this sort of violence without a purpose, or which has not the same kind of purpose that I just talked about with regards to Dirty Harry. It's something that is throughout, is constant throughout Violent Cop, but also, as Tom pointed out, in most of Kitano's filmography. And to me, I think that's a fascinating feature, to combine this, these two features that have on the surface nothing in common, this intense sort of violence at the one point, and then this sort of kind of humor. But then I asked the question whether this is maybe particular Japanese humor to combine these two elements. I'm not sure about it.
I would say it's more unique to Kitano, purely based on some of the other Yakuza flicks, even around the same period. It's such a, and I think that it's what makes him so appealing, at least maybe to international audiences. It's so unique. You might think it's this kind of like, you know, Japanesey type of thing, but I think even comparing him to his contemporaries, it's very bizarre. But I mean, it kind of, when you think about him in the context of how Japanese audiences would have seen him at the time as a comedian, you know, response to the film, and especially the bits we're talking about where you're not sure whether you should be laughing or not, they probably would have just seen it as funny because it's a comedic figure acting it away, you know, especially, I mean, I know we're going to discuss the slapping scene later on, but it is interesting that we kind of have that conflicted response as an international audience, whereas a Japanese audience at the time of release might have been a bit more kind of definitive about, no, it's funny, like.
Yeah. But also, I feel that the similarity with Harry Callahan is that they both seem like people who understand that in order to confront the really bad criminals, but in this case even the lowest ones, that it's you have to be as violent and as cruel as they are. This becomes more evident throughout the movie. But another big difference is that although Harry Callahan is presented as a hero, Azuma is not presented as a hero at all. This introductory scene that he beats up a kid essentially without any need to do so establishes the fact that this is not a hero. He's an anti-hero, if anything. There is no particular reason why he has to be so violent, at least in the beginning.
Okay. You can just to add to that, you can look at the whole idea of sort of violence just breeds more violence. And if you look at sort of the escalation of the conflicts in the film, arguably you wouldn't get to such an explosive finale were it not for Azuma's violent approach. But then again, nothing might have been done about the sort of crime syndicates in the film in the first place. So it's a double-edged sword. I definitely think it takes the nihilistic sort of route, particularly with the ending.
Yeah.
With that idea of a nihilistic route, which is something that is very essential for many of Kitano's features, especially this one, because as you said, Panos, he's not presented as the hero. In fact, I would go so far as to say he has more in common with the hitman than with any of the other people here, which interestingly is an interesting parallel to Hanabi, where his character also has some similarities with the hitman. There are many times when these two characters meet each other, one time in the hitman's apartment and then at one time in the streets, and you have an idea. The same with the opening, you could act here. The hitman could kill Azuma or vice versa, but they don't act upon it. They don't do anything. They sort of recognize that this is, that there's somebody who is similar to me. You know, there's also a person born out of violence, defined by violence, But as we said early on, there's just violence in this character. It doesn't serve any purpose anymore, and this is where this deconstruction aspect comes into place, because when you think that these people do these horrible acts without any purpose, without any meaning, the investigation is going nowhere, or you basically know who it is, then what kind of purpose do these people have?
But essentially, what becomes what I feel about the character of Azuma from the beginning is, okay, he's obviously an asshole. He's like this big bully that he also happened to be legit because he's a policeman and he can get away with all the bullying that he does, because his attitude does not go only against criminals, it goes against everyone. He is violent with every person that comes across his path. Yeah. But at the same time, although he is who he is, this violent, antisocial person, in the end he emerges as someone very likable. I think we all root for him at the end. One aspect of this, we may say, that is the fact that he has to take care of his sister, who seems to have some kind of, is mentally handicapped in a way. It seems that way at least. And also, the second way that he does that, it's that it becomes obvious that he has a code of honor. He doesn't take bribes. He's not associated with the Yakuza, with something that becomes obvious a lot of his colleagues do as the story progresses. So, in what ways do you think that he becomes likable in the end, this violent bully?
Rouven, you can go first.
I think it has much to do with the script. I mean, at the hitman and especially his henchmen do so many horrible things. I mean, what they're doing to his sister is so horrible, so sordid, that I feel as a viewer I can't help but root for Azuma to get there in time and to do something about it. Yeah. However, that doesn't necessarily make him likable for me. I mean, I think I root for him because I want him to go there and to stop whatever they're doing. But I don't like this person at all just because he does that.
No, I completely agree. And to be honest, I thought you were going to go the other route, which is why I kind of asked you first. But yeah, I think he's almost the hero by default. I think the stuff that Kiyohiro and some of the other quote-unquote villains in the film do is so deplorable that you can't help but root for Azuma. You know, I think he's quite amoral, to be honest. It's that kind of almost old examination of the line between the law and criminals, where it's just like you're only rooting for him because it's, towards the end, at least for me, because you feel like you should be, because he is still the cop at the end of the day. In terms of his actions and the kind of character that he shows himself to be, and I think about halfway through for me, I was sort of thinking there'll be like a redemption sort of moment here. There'll be a moment where it's very clear and definitive. Oh no, he is good. There is that line. But I think what we were saying earlier about him and Kiyohiro almost being this duality, they're almost like the same kind of person with this violent intent. They just happen to have fallen onto different sides of the law. And that's kind of the only thing that separates them. And if you swap the two characters and their scenarios, you'd probably feel very differently about either of them. You know, it's a matter of circumstance for me. So I don't think he's particularly likable, other than the fact that he's played by Kitano and he's quite a likable, charismatic figure anyway.
I mean, there is this connection to the sister character, but the script or the movie itself, I'm not sure how much was changed when Kitano took over, but there is nothing is really done with this kind of connection. It feels like he is obliged. He says, well, it's my sister, she's part of the family, and I have to do something, I have to do something about it, but that's about it. At least the film doesn't do very much with that sort of connection. I mean, we can talk about, let's say, the female character in this film, because she feels, or she mirrors that kind of detachment that he has with the society around him. He feels so disconnected with this society, probably less so than the other characters that we see, because, as you said, Panos, he still has a certain kind of code that he follows, which gives me, tells me that he has something other than that. But again, this movie doesn't do anything with this connection, doesn't make it, let's say, emotional, or something like that, which is very, very different to, for example, to come back to the Dirty Harry parallel, which is very, very different to, let's say, the romantic relationships that Dirty Harry Callahan has, or the relationships with his colleagues, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Just quickly on the note of just to follow up on that, on the note of how much was changed during the shooting process from the original script, I believe that Hisashi Nozawa has virtually disowned the film and didn't want the screenwriting credit for it, because things were virtually being changed day to day. So the story, the story is essentially just the character names and a very basic plot line, that everything else was sort of changed by Kitano. And I completely agree as well that with his sister character in particular, there's such a detachment there. You expect so much more of an emotional response from Azuma when she does find herself in trouble later on, but it's almost like her being in trouble is just another excuse for him to enact more violence. That's the only thing that seems to be kind of motivating him. And I believe as well, there was even a moment earlier in the film, just on his moral sort of compass, if you like, the young detective who's working with him, Kokichi, he sort of says, like, how did you become a cop again? He's just like, like I got a referral from a friend. It's like there was no sort of, there's no sort of like Hollywood backstory of, oh, my father was killed, and about, like, it was just happenstance, and it's an excuse for him to sort of get away with doing what he wants to do, both good and bad, because there are moments where he takes the violent route where he doesn't need to, in both for good and just completely unnecessarily. So
I think the most telling scene in that regard is when a second dealer is being murdered. There was this scene when he visits the second dealer, and when Azuma visits the second dealer, and he basically wants some information who is behind the murder of the other cop, the one who dealt with the drugs. And there is this, I think, a railway crossing or something like that, where he goes over, or something like that. And on his way up, on his way upstairs, you see that he meets the hitman, but they just meet very briefly, and they pass each other, and it's almost like a sketch in let's say Monty Python. And Azuma goes his way until he's at something like a railway station, until he suddenly turns around, and as if he just like, you know what, I'm a cop, I have to follow this. And this tells you so much about how detached this person truly is.
Yeah.
Also,
funny.
Yeah. Also, I think the movie is rather judgmental, essentially deconstructing the whole concept of the policeman. It's not just Azuma who thinks he's above the law. It's also all the policemen that we see in the film are, okay, you have Iwaki, who is corrupted, and he provides drugs to drugs dealer. But also you have his boss, who is he's like a paper pusher who seems to do nothing apart from punishing his policeman and trying to be as political as possible. And then you have the rookie who is trying to be as lawful as possible and follow all the procedures, but obviously his way does not work. And I think it's also very interesting that the movie shows that Kitano's way, Azuma's way, is the only thing that it works against these criminals. You remember the scene where 5 of them trying to arrest the drug dealer and they all get beaten up until Azuma hits him with the car and finally manages to arrest him, but the rest of them got beaten. So
no.
What do you think says about the police, the film?
I mean, it's like you said, it's sort of all of the stereotypes to a T in one movie, isn't it? Almost, again, to a comical degree, where the paper-pushing chief is so hardline and Iwaki is kind of so pathetically corrupt, you know, and Kikuchi is really is like the very budding, spirited young. I think it's those stereotypes just playing off of Azuma as this oddball character in the mix of things. And just to go back to what you were saying, Rouven, about him being so detached, it is almost like he's just kind of an observer in the middle of everything that's going on, who is occasionally jumping in to act. And, you know, the more the film goes on, he's a cop only really in name, you know, rather than in spirit or in anything like that. And it does feel like that scene that you mentioned where they're all been beaten up and he's just standing at the door, just watching. Like, he seems quite amused by it all. I think the film's quite, like we said, it's nihilistic, and especially when it comes to the ending, which I'm not sure if we'll go into detail on, but just it's very much the status quo is resumed. It didn't really mean anything. I suppose you can take whatever commentary on the police out of that you want, in just not getting to the root of problems, ineffective in a sense. It's short-term gains. Yeah.
Rouven?
I think one of my fascinations with Kitano has to do with the scene where the police chief is introduced. We see him giving a speech to his men about his sort of virtues. I'm not sure about the exact wording, but he says something about cleaning up the city, cleaning up the department. And then we see him with this the first encounter with him and Azuma, and you basically get the idea, well, it's just words, just empty phrases. And Kitano does that all the time. And I think he pushes forward this sort of idea with the Yakuza genre and with the cop thriller genre, basically showing you this is just politics, this is just illusion. There is one thing, these principles, these virtues, or these sort of procedures and traditions, or whatever it is. And that's just the illusion, that's just what goes on the stage. What matters is what happens backstage. Backstage is where the treason happens, is where the violence happens, is where everything happens that means something. And the players who do something, who doing their job, or who play their roles, it doesn't mean anything. What matters is who says what goes on backstage. And there is this image of this boss, I can't remember his name, this gangster boss who sits in this office, very blank office, nothing is in there, it's just 2 desks, one secretary who's hammering in numbers, I don't know what she's doing all the time, and he's sitting there motionless. He's the one who's pulling all the strings. What these people are doing, these cops, these dealers, they are just pawns in the game. They're just following orders, following directions, which may lead to their death. And interestingly or ironically, somebody like Azuma seems to be aware of that. Seems to be aware of the fact that he's that pawn in a game, or that what he said, as Tom says, may just be ineffective, but he's just playing along.
He's just a wild card in the bunch. Like, he really is. And it just sort of, to go back to the point I was making earlier, you talk about the Yakuza boss there, and it's like, yeah, Azuma's reporting to his police chief, who's a certain type of hardline in one organization, if you want to call it, but he could have just as easily fallen on the other side. And I don't think he'd be too different as a character. He's just kind of enjoying being around an opportunity for violence and chaos and not really having to, pay the price for it, which I guess you could say is a commentary on the police as well, because he's essentially, if you look at it in that frame, it's essentially saying, look, I'm basically acting like a gangster within the police. This character could have just as easily flipped over to the other side and he wouldn't really be any different. So
And so to follow up on what Rouven said, all characters are pawns, but with the exception of Azuma and Kiyohiro, I think, which they cannot be controlled. This becomes evident mid-film about Kiyohiro also, with Nito is the name of the Yakuza boss, who at some point says that he's a wild card. We can control him, and maybe we should have someone kill him at some point if he goes too far away, which is, I think, another interesting point, that the two wild cards are the ones that really stand out and get things done, let's say. These are the two people that get things done in the movie.
Yeah, well, they don't sort of abide to the norm. They very much shake things up by just taking matters into their own hands, which, just kind of leads to, on the one hand, it's what you said earlier, Panos, of just about they get things done, but on the other hand, they also kind of burn everything down with them.
Exactly. And also, you both said that they are very similar, but there is a small difference between Kiyohiro and Azuma. They are both very violent, but Azuma beats them up. Kiyohiro kills them, which is it's a difference. I think it's significant to distinguish who is the good guy and who is the bad guy.
Yeah, no, definitely. And just on you mentioning it, it does show that Azuma does respect the limits that he's placed within, as far as they go, and in Kiyohiro's case, being part of the Yakuza, his limits are killing. So
And also, I think another very interesting aspect about Kiyohiro is that we have a scene in the film which is kind of funny in the way that Azuma mocks Kiyohiro. Is the one that he finds out that he's a homosexual because he finds him in the bed with another young man. And there is a small scene before that where Nito's right-hand man, the one in his office, says that Kiyohiro would do anything for Nito. And I think that as the story progresses, there seems to imply that Kiyohiro is actually something of maybe in love with Nito. They have this relationship that he would do anything about him. I don't know if you picked up something like that. I think it's very subtle, but it shows the fact that he is willing to sacrifice himself for his boss. It also has a homoerotic element. I don't know if you noticed that, or Rouven?
Well, I sort of noticed it upon, let's say, the third viewing, because when, as you said, he is quite a wild card, and at one point you ask yourself, well, why is he, putting up with that boss who's basically trying to control him or represents the means to control him? I think I read it somewhere that Azuma and the Hitman are both characters who crave for violence, not just inflict violence, but actually want this sort of violence to be inflicted upon them. And this scene where the boss is slapping his hitman quite repeatedly, and the way he just takes it in without responding, without defending himself, tells you there is not just a homoerotic element between those two characters, but also, I would even say, a masochistic element between them, especially from the hitman, who actually likes that sort of thing. And I mean, the fact that he interrogation scene where he basically lets Azuma hit him repeatedly, and that also shows he actually likes that sort of that violence to be inflicted upon him. At least that's what I take from it.
Tom?
I can't say that I read it that way. I do think that's an interesting interpretation, to be honest, and it definitely does hold some ground. But I saw him sort of catching him in the act, so to speak, as more of just a kind of like a cheap embarrassment for him. I didn't really take it as anything more than that. But there's definitely something to be said there, especially with Kiyohiro's attitude towards violence in general.
By the way, Takeshi Kitano watched that film before he did Ishi.
Yeah. I made that connection also. The character Tadanobu Asano plays in Ichi the Killer seems to have a similar relationship with his Yakuza boss.
I mean, maybe that's going too far, but at least that's the way I'm feeling about it.
I have not yet seen Ichi the Killer, so
okay.
No spoilers would be nice.
Okay. So, since we talked a lot about slapping, we have one of the most iconic scenes in the film is the bathroom scene where Azuma catches a drug dealer and slaps him. Like, I think Kitano actually slaps the other actor in this scene. I think it's obvious that the slaps are pretty real. I don't think there's much acting there. I don't know. What did you think about this scene?
It goes from you're just watching the film normally to, okay, this is really funny, to, okay, when is this going to stop? It just seems to go on and on. That scene in particular reminds me of Kitano's character in Boiling Point, which he did after, where the way that the violence is presented in that film is sort of similar to in this film, and in that scene in particular, the slapping scene, where it's very it is slapstick, but just because of how long it goes on for and how kind of bluntly violent it is, you don't know whether it should be as funny as it is, but it's just so deadpan. I love it. It's one of the best scenes in the movie.
Rouven?
Yeah. I think we don't give that filming enough credit when it comes to comparing it to the great comics. I mean, every great comic has a sort of masochistic or violent element to it. When I watch, for example, the Marx Brothers, when they do their sketch, especially not Groucho, what's the name? I can't remember. One of them has a sort of, even though he's quite funny, there is a certain masochistic element to it. Whatever mayhem he produces, he likes that. And this is the sort of vibe I get from the sort of comedy that Kitano plays. Even though it's meant to be funny and I laugh at it, it has a very, very dark element to it. And I think this scene specifically exposes it. I mean, as Tom said, it goes on and on and on and on, and you feel like it's going on forever until there is no purpose to it. I mean, he slaps him after he has asked a question about whether, I'm not sure what the question was. I think where he gets the drugs from or something.
Yeah, exactly.
And the question doesn't matter. He just does violence for violence sake, and it becomes sort of ridiculous. I mean, even the drug dealer sort of at one point starts laughing at it.
Yeah. But also, I don't know. This is okay. We're gonna talk about this after this, but the film is quite ironic, and I feel this scene is a testament to the fact, because he slaps him like, I don't know, 20, 25 times, but before the 25th time, he doesn't speak. He doesn't tell who is his dealer. After he slapped 25 times, then he gives up the name, which essentially says that this practice actually works, which I feel is kind of ironic, extreme comment about, it's a comedic, essentially. I don't know what you feel about this.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially stripping down what could be a very bloated interrogation scene that would be, you know, like in an interrogation room in a police station, and you've got extended dialogue and stuff. It essentially just stripped it down to, I need to know thing. I'm going to hit you until you tell me thing, and because of how the scene has to go, you're eventually going to tell me. You know, that scene could have easily been 5 minutes in another movie. With a lot of back and forth and a lot of sort of hard talk from the criminal, but it just watered it down to what he needed to get out of it, and ended up turning it into a really funny gag, you know.
Rouven?
I agree with what Tom says. I think when you play the scene and turn off the volume and just look at it like, for example, a silent comedy, it shows you how funny it is, specifically because it goes on for so long until it is basically just violence for violence sake, and getting rid of the sound actually makes you aware of the comedy behind it, which is true for many other scenes. For example, the chase scene that you mentioned, Panos, is one of those scenes which, if you turn off the sound, could have easily been part of, let's say, a silent comedy.
No, well, just on the chase scene as well. Just if the slapping scene is a stripped down, you know, bare bones version of an interrogation scene, the chase scene is extraordinarily long compared to what it would be in any other movie. It's just, I mean, it's entertaining, but it shows you every single stage of the chase. Not all of which are particularly entertaining or action packed.
You mean the car chase or the one where the car chase?
I'm talking about the car chase, yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. I feel that this whole sense of irony that permeates the film, it's actually the second big scene of that aspect is this car chase scene, which is probably the worst car chase scene we have ever seen, in the way nothing works for the policeman, and in the end they just end up, you know, hitting the guy with the car. It's ridiculous. It's not fast. It doesn't have any kind of agony in it. But you can say it's actually kind of realistic, the point that it's presented, but at the same time funny in the way it mocks all the usual car chases we see in films from Hollywood, let's say.
Yeah.
And I also like the fact how he, for example, slow motion, how he takes out the action or takes away the speed of it. And also with cross-cutting, for example, we see images of Azuma's colleagues having a casual drink or something like that on the side, and it feels like, what are they doing? I mean, are they chasing the guy? Is this the actors? I mean, is this not the characters, but is this the actors enjoying the time off camera? Because it looks like it, and he's taking away all the speed of a, let's say, chase, and makes it into something that is so ridiculous and so funny. I think the moment when I laughed out loud was when Azuma told his young colleague, "You better switch off the siren. You give away our location." It was so funny.
Yeah.
I do think it's worth noting that because of the status that Kitano has now internationally as a filmmaker, I do think that going back and looking at especially his early work, it's easy to perhaps try and find meaning and intention in everything that he was doing. I do think there is room for a case to say that because this was his first film, you know, we don't know what it was like in the original script. I don't know if the original version of the script has been published. I certainly haven't seen it or read it, but if that had been written as a standard, you know, maybe car chase or foot chase, coming into the film as a first-time director and being in a background of doing comedy on TV, he might have looked at that and said, right, well, I can't do that. So how can I turn this into something that I can do, which would be, you know, something comedic, which is what the car chase sort of ends up being. And you could even say maybe the same for the slapping scene, where he's like, right, I'm not confident in doing this kind of interrogation scene or whatever this is set up to be. How can I turn this into something that I know how to do and make it effective in my own way?
That's an interesting observation that you just did there. We could say the same thing about the shootouts in the film. If you compare this to shootouts, for example, in a John Woo movie, or even from Fukasaku, if you look at for Cops vs. Dogs or any of his other features, he takes away the action with the fact that there are people who just standing there and shooting at each other, blank face or stone faced, and he's just like with the slapping scene. He strips away everything, and it's just two guys shooting at each other, no emotions whatsoever. And yeah, I mean, he does the same thing with the car chase and with the interrogation. Yeah.
Okay, what I also wanted to say is that about the car chase scene, there is also another subtle, very funny moment at the end of it, because Azuma and the rookie have been running around with their car for like 10 minutes, maybe. I don't know how much exactly this scene lasts, but the other two cops that they were running, essentially they were running on foot, they reached them just right afterwards. Essentially means that the car had no use at all. They could have just run on their feet and they would have covered the same distance if they just run. I feel also it's a bit of humoristic the way that as soon as the whole thing stops, the other two cops immediately appear. Yeah. So also is this sense of funny and ironic sense that is in the movie. I also feel the same way goes about the use of music, which you have this kind of romantic electronic tracks being heard to when the most violent scenes are taking place. Also, I feel it is ironic. I don't know, Tom?
I thought at least on my viewing, I thought it sort of set the mood more a little bit. Just because, like we touched on a second ago, that the shootouts and stuff aren't really these wall to wall like action scenes, like crazy explosions and stuff like that. They're very kind of moody and blunt and quick. And I thought that the more sort of somber soundtrack in those moments kind of set the tone a little more then. But I mean, to talk about the soundtrack, especially like the main sort of theme of the film and sort of the opening music when he's walking across that bridge, that definitely feels a little bit more abrasive and sort of taking the mick.
Rouven?
I think in terms of stylization, Daisuke Kume, I think is the name of the composer. Steam heightens this sense of stylization at the very beginning when this person is introduced. You get the feeling, oh, there's some, in combination with what we have witnessed earlier when he's beating up the teenager, and sort of you get the feeling this is a person who is this, as we said, wild card. You get that feeling. And in the chase sequence at the very beginning, when you have this very slow track in combination with the slow motion, it has a certain, I'm not sure if I'm getting it right, but it has a certain, it feels like a ballet, almost. This slow motion, then you get, and then with the comedy, with all these police officers, I mean, what are they doing? Jumping over each other in a certain way, which again sort of mirrors Hanabi. I think there's a sort of particular or similar scene, but in this case, it seems, yeah, as we said, it seems in the context of the scene, it adds to the fact that there are people just observing the action, like Azuma not doing anything, and waiting their turn to get in on the violence or to get some sort of cheap shot on the suspect, and taking away the tempo of the scene, which again adds to the anticlimactic way the whole scene, the whole chase is executed. And at the same time adds to the violent nature of the whole action.
Yeah, I agree, particularly what you're saying with sort of that almost sort of ballet feel. I know it's more of a mood and an atmosphere than a literal sort of ballet. But there's the slow motion scene when involving the baseball bat, if you two know which one I'm referencing, with the cop being attacked, which is in slow motion and the music's playing over that. And I have to say that really kind of stood out to me as like this. It's painted, especially like sort of the composition of it as well. It's painted as this almost sort of like beautiful moment, but it really isn't.
Exactly. That's the irony I was referring to, exactly this thing actually. And also to talk about some of the iconic scenes, I feel the one with the shootout and the second duel between Kiyohiro and Azuma in the street, in the middle of the street, are probably the most maybe agonizing even, because you have the film has come to a point that both of them can actually die and you would not consider it a surprise. At the same time, I want to point something else about the scene where Kitano is holding a knife and Kiyohiro a gun, and they fight in the middle of the street. That you see that none of the people around them reacts almost at all. This thing is happening. Nobody is yelling, and nobody tries to do anything to stop it. They are just observing what is happening. Also could be perceived as a bit, I don't know, irony or comment, or I perceived it that way at least. I don't know, Rouven?
I just remembered this scene where you said there are these that the pedestrians are actually passing by, observing, and at the very end of this sort of confrontation, when they're on the street, there is this scene where one woman gets shot by accident. And, at first, when I saw it, it was like just when the baseball bat, as Tom mentioned, hit or connected with the other police officer's head. It sort of felt like a shock at that first point. And when I watched it, even though it sounds very dark, what I'm just about saying, it also is. Sorry, but it's quite funny.
I laughed out loud at that moment. I have to. I laughed out loud. At that
really?
Yeah.
The way it's delivered with the deadpan expression and the hysterical cries of the woman's friend, it's so hysterical at this point. Specifically in that sort of scene, you have this idea that there is a very fateful, sort of confrontation between these two individuals, between the hitman and between the hitman and the detective, and then this moment happens, and it's sort of, I don't know, it doesn't make it at first glance, it doesn't make sense to show this sort of scene or this sort of sequence or this sort of image, but then again it adds to this sort of anticlimactic moment and to the comedy of it.
Oh wow! See, I mean, in terms of the comedy of it, I can certainly see where both of you are coming from, and in a way, it's sort of just what we were talking about slapstick earlier. Sort of violence and comedy is sort of strangely linked in that way, especially on film. But I mean, I couldn't disagree more in terms of my reaction, especially to those two moments. Just to make the point that obviously, sort of the bar for sensitivity in film in terms of violence and stuff is always being raised, so something that came out over 30 years ago now isn't going to be as shocking as it was at the time, or at least it shouldn't be in terms of its content. So I mean, rarely will I be watching an old film and genuinely sort of have my jaw on the floor, but I mean, those two moments in particular with the baseball bat and the woman being shot, I was legitimately shocked, and they're sort of deeply imprinted onto my mind, just those images and that blood spurt, and in that very short instance, I think the way that he executes those kills, no pun intended, that it's very urgent, it's very graphic in comparison, because they're so calculated, it's very clinical. Those scenes, or those moments, I should say, even.
I feel that. Okay, sorry. I feel that the whole style of comedy in the film has a lot of gags in it, which is, I think this is a gag, essentially, the way it presents it. And also, you have to remember that this is the 80s still, right? The film is 1989.
Yeah.
People were not so sensitive or political correct, let's say, at that point. So I think it's more obvious that it's humoristic. And
Mm.
I don't know, it seems like it's the trademark humor Kitano, which is always a little bit violent and that way, I think, shocking and funny at the same time. Rouven?
Yeah, and the way and the reason why I like Kitano so much is he is, to me at least, he mirrors the sort of, let's say, absurdist comedies. When I think of, let's say, Samuel Beckett, Waiting for Godot, you have characters who are waiting for somebody who doesn't arrive. And here you have two characters in Violent Cop who committing violent acts for, as we just found out, for no purpose at all, just violence for violence sake. And this sort of comedy in between, these sort of gags, visual gags or let's say verbal gags, they add to this absurdist kind of comedy. You have a very minimalist or stripped down narrative, and it adds to this absurd notion of the whole, not just of the characters, but the whole world. Like, what are these characters? What are these characters doing? What are they looking for in this scene? They are just committing, horrific acts for no purpose at all. The only purpose being that they are somewhat connected to each other because they both come from this world. They are both violent characters, and they are connected by this. I'm not sure if I would call it homoerotic notion, but at least some sort of notion to them.
I don't think I could go that far with the last point. I do think that at that point in the film, in terms of the street confrontation, there is, I feel personally at least, that there is more of a purpose to the violence, purely because they've gone past that point where they're now on a personal vendetta against each other, which for me at least made that confrontation far more tense than I was anticipating. Yeah, just to follow up very briefly on what Panos, you were saying earlier, just thinking about it, the reaction of sort of the people standing around in the street while that confrontation is happening. I don't know if it's so much a sort of ironic commentary as it is more a sort of realistic depiction of what you do, because I don't know if you guys have sort of seen like a fight break out in the street, or like somebody starts shouting, or there's some kind of punch up in a bar or something. Your reaction to it is kind of stilted, and typically in films, or at least where sort of major characters are concerned or bystanders are concerned, you have this very overly dramatized reaction of everyone sort of throwing their hands up in the air or running away or trying to get involved or trying to stop it. But in reality, you just kind of stand there and just kind of process it as it's happening, and you're like, oh shit, like sometimes you see like blood or something in a fight. It takes a while to register, just because it's so like out of the ordinary. So I mean, I don't know if that's that scene in particular is just a more realistic depiction of just, oh my god, this guy's just pulled out a knife and is trying to, like you wouldn't really compute it.
Actually, that is what I meant. What you are saying, it's ironic not towards. I think the whole movie has a purpose of being ironic towards cop crime movies, that he makes fun of, the car chases, or the way the protagonists shoot each other, or in this case how people react in these situations, and it's ironic towards movies than reality. This is what I was meaning essentially.
And I think in the context of a world that the film creates, which is defined by violence, not just the characters, but you have teenagers who are hitting homeless people in the streets. You have school children who are throwing litter at people. You have cops hanging from bridges, which is a horrific sight, but which in the context of the film sort of feel like byproducts of a world that is defined by this sort of violence. So I agree with you. When you see a fight on the street, or when you see a shooting on the street, you don't try to get into the action, so to speak.
Yeah, you don't react in the way that you think you would, or the way that someone would in a movie, and I think that's kind of the point of it.
But I think in context of that world, they are sort of so used to that violence, probably, or this violence in this world it doesn't strike you as something that you say, oh, that strikes me as something that is so unusual. It makes sense in this world to happen that way. I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but in that world that violent cop creates, it made sort of sense. So I agree with you. When people see something like that, they react that way. They are stupefied, they are in shock, they are trying to process what is going on, or just observing. So but I think in that world, in that film, maybe I'm over-interpreting, which I usually do. Maybe I'm over-interpreting here, but it sort of makes sense in that world that they react that way. Mm-hmm. By the way, this is something that happens often in Japanese movies. I think Japanese pedestrians in Japanese street, they are sort of used to the fact that people are, let's say, shooting movies around them. Because I can remember many scenes, not just in Kitano films, but also in films by Takashi Miike, Graveyard of Honor, for example, where you have a violent fight breaking out, or a person bleeding on the street, and nobody's reacting to it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, to move forward, maybe we can also talk a bit about the acting in the film. Okay, we have Takeshi Kitano as the undisputed star. I have to say, the thing that makes both Azuma and Kitano very likable for me in this movie is the scenes where he jokes and then he laughs with what he has said. This thing he does, his whole body is laughing. This makes him a very appealing character for me. I think it's one of his best assets in the movie. Okay, his whole performance is impressive, but I think this is like key point. Tom, about his performance in general?
No, I mean, look, Takeshi Kitano is incredibly charismatic in general. I mean, that's why he was so popular before the movie, and that's why he's remained popular today. You know, he's that kind of talented individual. I mean, I think the performances overall, you'd say they either fall into kind of a blank slate of a stereotype, if that makes sense, where it's very uniform characters, and they act exactly in the way that you would expect them to. You know, you have the cold, merciless hitman. You have the police chief that we talked about earlier. You've got the young, enthusiastic wannabe detective. Everyone nails their role, and I don't think there's a lot of room to experiment with it, but it's also not the point, you know.
Rouven, about Takeshi Kitano acting?
I think what I respect in terms of Kitano's acting in Violent Cop and many other of his features is the fact because he's doing so very little, and yet it has so much impact. When the scene where he's bleeding and the killer is standing in front of him, you could play this like, for example, him begging for his life, or him begging for mercy, or something like that. But he doesn't do that, and that's what I like about him as an actor and him as a director. He understands the material, he understands the sort of situation the person is in, and he's not overacting. He's not doing what might be the logical way for some actors, and he doesn't do that, which makes it stupefying to some degree, and all the more brilliant, in my opinion.
Okay, and for the rest of the memorable performances, definitely we have Hakuryu as Kiyohiro, he portrays the sociopath in, I don't know, he's really convincing to the point that some moment you can say this guy must be a bit sociopath himself, because he's really, really convincing in the way he shows no empathy in whatever he's doing. Tom?
Very distinct sense of style as well. There's a great wardrobe for this film.
Yeah. Rouven?
I mean, I saw him first in Hanabi, and then in Violent Cup, and even though he says and does very, very, very little, he, just like with Kitano's acting, he's also somebody who does very little but has a very distinct effect on you. You get the feeling, as you said, Panos, you get the feeling this person is not to be messed around with. This person will, if you are his mission, he will kill you, and he will not let you beg for mercy or anything. Yeah.
And I feel there's not bad performances in the film, but the one for me that also stands out is Ittoku Kishibe as Nito, the Yakuza boss, who, I don't know what to say about him. I think he's the definite boss. You can see how he orders everyone around, and he has the respect of everybody, but at the same time, I don't know, I think his whole performance and the way he portrays his character is somewhat funny. I'm not sure why exactly. Maybe it's his face even. You know, Ittoku Kishibe has a very characteristic face that sometimes he looks like a bird or something. And I don't know, this makes me laugh. Like, this is not exactly the face of a Yakuza boss, let's say, at least as we have it in movies. Tom?
Oh yeah, I mean, when it came to his character, again, there's not a lot of meat on the bones, but there didn't really need to be, and I did think that he had a great presence. You know, I think especially when he's talking to Kiyohiro, and you kind of have already seen him in action, and you know how dangerous he can be, and the way that he sort of so nonchalantly talks down to him without really a care. He's able to say a lot about the character and what he thinks of himself and his status without having an awful lot of dialogue or things to do. You know, I mean, do we even see him many times not behind the desk?
Very few. Just standing up, but yeah, very few. Rouven, about him, Ittoku Kishibe?
The impression that he actually lives in that office.
Exactly.
He spends his time sitting in that chair, and there's this, and also together with that woman who's always typing, doing, I don't know what she does. Trying to figure out Einstein's relativity theory or something.
Christmas cards. She was sorting out Christmas cards for the end of year Yakuza party.
It's another moment of irony about how the Yakuza are usually portrayed in films. The way the Yakuza boss is portrayed here, I think it's the same thing that comes up in the whole.
Not the funniest Yakuza boss. I think the funniest Yakuza boss has to be the one in Summer Team. That one is, to me, the funniest one, because he doesn't say anything. He just, there's this one image where he's just sitting in a chair like this, and he seems like a zombie or something like this. I think whenever I see him, I have to laugh uncontrollably.
Yeah, there is a lot of mocking of the traditional Yakuza bosses. He's portrayed in the Fukasaku movies, actually, in later movies. Yeah, there has been a lot of mocking about that. Okay, I guess that's it. Would you like to add anything before we close, Tom?
Look, I mean, if you haven't seen the film already, it's the perfect starting point, not only just because it's his first film, but I mean, I can't really think of many directors off the top of my head that have imprinted such a distinct style that has translated to the rest of their films as Takeshi Kitano with Violent Cop. I mean, it's kind of astounding, actually, given his inexperience as a filmmaker, at least. So yeah, I mean, if you haven't seen it, you kind of have to. It's almost essential viewing at this point.
Yeah, Rouven?
I can't add anything more. Go watch Violent Cop. There's a wonderful restoration by BFI of the film, which is superb to any other release that I have seen. Great film, great introduction to his work. And if you started with that, to go on and see Boiling Point and Sonatine, great films.
Yeah, this one here, actually.
That's the one.
Yeah, I don't like the color at all, but other than that, the whole edition is pretty great. Both the text there and the restoration is pretty impressive. That's the way to go. You have to see the film in your house, I guess.
No.
So I guess that's it for this week. Thank you for watching out. If you like those things, you can subscribe to our channel. We are gonna keep doing them. And from Panos Kotzathanasis, Rouven Linnarz, and Tom Wilmot, thank you for watching, and see you next week, most probably. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.